Most of you, I think, have had a chance now to view the film SOROS. We're so grateful to our filmmakers for being here today, and I'll go ahead and introduce them in a moment, but we have asked our provost, Vanya Quinones, to give a welcome to everyone on behalf of the university. I'll also mention that the session today is being recorded so that we can share it with my students, with Gina Scutelnicu students, and some other classrooms full of students who have watched the film as part of their curriculum this semester. So thank you, Vanya, for joining us.
Hello, everybody, and welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending to the SOROS film panel discussion. I would like to acknowledge the work of the director, Jesse Dillon, and the producer, Priscilla Cohen, and I'm very grateful that both of you are giving us time to talk to our students and to further discuss this important film. Inclusive civic engagement takes many forms, and being a change agent through visual storytelling is very impactful. And more importantly, it impacts our global community. Pace University has a long history of civic engagement, which is central to our mission, Oportunitas, and clearly demonstrates through most of our work through the Wilson Center, which Rebecca is the director, the Center for Communication, Action, and Research, CCCAR, our Carney Classification for Civic Engagement, Project Pericles, and Jefferson Awards recognitions at PACE. We place a strong emphasis on our social responsibility within the local and global environments. Today, more than ever, especially because of this, we were talking before about the isolation and how we really need the community and to feel alive through this pandemic. So today, more than ever, we need to emphasize the importance of raising through collective participation, reinforcing the fact that we are all connected. As a futurist engineer and architect, Richard Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And I think that's what all of you are doing, and I hope discuss about this civic engagement. So I want to thank and I want to wish a dynamic and thought-provoking panel discussion, which I know it will happen. And once again, Jesse and Priscilla, welcome to PACE. Anything you need, we're here, and congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya.
Thank you for having us.
So as I mentioned, I'm Rebecca Tekula. I'm the executive director of the Wilson Center here at PACE and a faculty member in our Department of Public Administration. I just want to say a quick hello to all my students that are in the audience today. You're what inspires us to do events like this, and we're really glad to bring something like this to you during a time that it's hard for us to be together, but hopefully this goes a long way to build community and to encourage the thoughtful discussion and critical thinking as we think about our world and our role in it, in particular in terms of civic engagement and participation. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speakers. We've circulated more information with the links to the event if you would like to read more about them. We have Jesse Dillon, the director of the film, Priscilla Cohen, the producer of the film, and Gina Scutelnicu, who is a chair and professor in the Department of Public Administration here at PACE. Thank you all for being with us today. This film is especially poignant given recent events, and we're really grateful for the opportunity for our students to hear about it and discuss it with you and to view it. I can say myself, having first viewed the film back in December when we were first talking about doing an event like this and a screening for our community, I had a different reaction to when I rewatched it again last night in preparation for today. And I think I'm hearing very visceral reactions from my students who've been watching it over the past week. And I think we're all kind of digesting how we now live in an environment that very well fits in the film, and we have been, but maybe we haven't all realized it so much until recently. And so my first question is for Jesse. Can you talk about your concept of the film? of an open society and George Soros's concept of an open society, and how you intend for that to come through in the film.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I guess the way that I think about an open society would be that, you have democracy, but if democracy was just, about, who had the most votes, the group that would have the most votes would ultimately decide that the other side was bad and get rid of them. So in an open society, it's being tolerant of all voices, especially minority voices and people who are kept away from the center. So I think the idea of the film is really to try and get that across. And then the second part of it is, that what can we as individuals do, about these inequalities that we see around us individually. So my hope would be that people watch the film. It's about George Soros, but it's really about us all individually and how we can participate in society and, think about the town square and all the voices that should be represented there.
Great. And, when thinking about which faculty would add an interesting perspective to our panel today, I immediately thought of my friend and colleague, Gina Scutelnicu, knowing about her own background personally and education, having some content or context with open society funded programs. I think I remembered it from when you came to PACE, seeing it in your CV, and having myself been involved in some way with OSI through former nonprofit work. I thought it would be really interesting for me personally and for all of us to hear about, Gina, your own experience growing up in Romania and how these programs were introduced to you, what that was like, and kind of in retrospect, maybe a little bit about the view of Soros and through that light.
Thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me. So I was really excited. So when I heard about the documentary and when I watched it, actually there were several instances that identified to me as an individual. So just to provide a bit of background information. So I'm originally from Romania. So I was about 12. I think I was 12 when the Berlin Wall fell. The impact that open society had on my education, actually it helped me start my PhD studies in the United States as well. But just to explain a bit of context, and that's very similar to what was happening in the Central and Eastern European countries in the 90s and early 2000s. So following the fall of the Berlin Wall, so George Soros opened up a lot of opportunities in these countries, and initially, as he details in the documentary, inspired by his own background, he wanted to give back to the part of the world he was originally from. Just a bit of background. So this closed societies like Romania as a country, so we didn't have access to the outside world in terms of resources, educational experiences like exchange programs. We didn't even know that we could study abroad, read some books, and they might seem, today reflecting back after so many years, I just realized how much society evolved. Open Society Institute was also an initiative and opening a network of arts and education institutes in Central and Eastern European countries. And what we would basically have access to, so information about, competitions, scholarships outside, even taking the TOEFL for those of you who are international students. I know I've seen some of our students in here. GRE, LSAT, yes, all of these things. So somebody had to organize and do this part. And where I went to school, so it's a city that's close to Hungary, so that has a large minority Hungarian minority population as well. So I think there is typically a joke that Romania kind of opens up with Transylvania, and because it's closer to the Western world. So that was initially, so during my high school, because I went there for high school and college, so I had access to this like oasis of information that I know it sounds maybe different today, but at that point it helped me tremendously. And then there was another opportunity that shaped my, my position here. And I am one of those first generation college students, who made it to the United States. And I was the recipient of a global supplementary scholarship. So I know in the United States, Open Society is known for slightly different areas of activity, but that's how this whole process started, with a focus on the educational part and facilitating these exchanges, education research between the closed and open societies. So I'm very thankful, very grateful for the opportunity of benefiting from all these educational activities.
And so now, Gina, you teach in our chair of our Department of Public Administration. And so you teach students here in the US about civic engagement, participation, yes, the public policy process, democracy, all of these things. So it's an interesting arc of your narrative that now you're here teaching US and international students, and our student population in the public administration program tends to be working professionals who are civil servants themselves, working in healthcare administration or nonprofit management. And maybe with that perspective, can you talk a bit about what civic engagement and participation looked like in Eastern Europe as when you were 12 and today? And maybe at what point participation, the way that we teach it to students, might not be enough when we think about these kind of hard-fought freedoms that we're trying to protect.
Yeah, so I think there is a big difference, and I mean, I've been watching the news lately, but there is a big difference on how civic participation occurs in, Eastern Central Europe compared to here. And also reflecting back on my time as an undergrad student in Romania. But there is, the direct involvement and participation, which typically occurs through protests, through community mobilization. And this is typically happening in response to, trying to fight this lack of trust in governmental institutions, because basically that's all it comes down to. And I do recall, and I was reflecting today what I was going to say, preparing several things, but I think it's more beneficial to share a story. When I was an undergraduate student, so there was a public opinion center that was promoted by the organized civil society. So that would be the second way through which people in Eastern and Central Europe kind of tend to participate. So the direct participation is more, when they are not pleased and they kind of go and protest. And we've seen this quite recently. We've seen this everywhere, but the organized civil society kind of facilitates and guides how people participate. Yeah, so I wouldn't say, and how well this organized civil society is or not, so it depends and it varies. And I think it hasn't been quite as successful as it has been in the Western world, and especially in the United States. So this public opinion center kind of administered questionnaires, survey questionnaires, to get a feeling on how, on the level of trust that the population had in the state institutions, in each other. Because I think, to me, this idea of being engaged and participate come from trusting the government institutions, but also trusting, social trust, the bigger concept, and trusting people around you. And that's kind of motivates you to participate and be involved. And I do remember, and now, making the connections on how those questions, how much do you trust the church? How much do you trust the government? And those were conducted annually, and they were actually part of a larger effort of a non-governmental organization similar to the Open Society, which was trying to engage and get a feeling where people are, try to get them to a common denominator. And the Open Society Institute and SOROS Foundation in Romania had played a similar role by facilitating the citizen engagement through the civil society. So they, especially, so there were projects about anti-corruption. So this is still debating today, and that's one of the big areas that might have been not as successful in Central and Eastern Europe, but also, you know, political party finance, you know, political participation of underrepresented groups such as Roma communities. So I know that has been a large, so there are areas where we could, you know, see improvements. I think what's missing and what's different from United States, you do see people have a higher level of social trust, and there are various studies that point to this as well. And it will be a long way until, you know, we're going to see the same level of citizen participation in Eastern Europe as we see in here. But I do think that participation and engagement happens the most and started happening the most because of an organized civil society rather than a direct participation. And I think that would be the biggest difference that I see between the two worlds.
Interesting. And Gina and I are talking about a research project. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of new ideas and research questions we could ask that's related to this. So Jesse or Priscilla, what can we learn from the film, in your opinion, about where we can go from here as a country, as a democracy, maybe thinking about participation and trust and all of these issues, especially in light of recent events?
Priscilla?
Well, I think, you know, where can we go from here? I mean, it's a what have we learned, you know, from the film, I think, or in our making of the film. Here's the thing. What the film hopefully shows us is something about the fragility of democracy. And that, you know, for me, one of the really most poignant moments was when we were in Sarajevo, and our wonderful theater director, very prominent theater director, said to us, and this was several years ago when we conducted that interview, he said, "How did this happen? We didn't see this coming. We didn't see this coming." And I think that is the big lesson. I think, Rebecca, in your introduction, you know, we talk about maybe this was always, you know, hidden, and we were not awake to the challenge of democracy. I think for a lot of us, I grew up in the United States. I kind of took democracy and open society for granted. I took the idea that, you know, whatever political identification you had, people would be congenial, and maybe one party would be in power. But as Jesse said in the very beginning, the definition of an open society includes conversation on all sides and wants more voices in. And I think that it has been incredibly shocking to what happened to our country, but I think it's been happening for many, many years. And in fact, in our kind of conversations with George, in being privy to a lot of the work that the Open Society Foundations does around the world, we've traveled around the world. You know, we were learning about this several years ago, and I think that was also part of the. We felt it was very important to kind of get this story out. First, to tell the story of George, who is the most vilified person, probably one of them on the planet, and most misunderstood. And to kind of set the story up around, really show his life, which has its roots in the Holocaust, which has its roots in communism, and the most kind of heinous fascism we've ever seen. And then from that place, you know, he goes through his life, he makes his money, and then he decides, wait a minute, I'm gonna now invest in people and in the idea of an open society. So I think what it tells us is we have to be vigilant. What it tells us is that misinformation is a dangerous thing. And really critical thinking, with which universities are a great, hopefully, believer in and supporter of, can make us be hyper aware, and particularly the people in this group, this class, who are working in administration and civil society, the idea of accountability, we can't let our foot off the pedal of democracy, right? We have to stay vigilant. So that for me is it's a dangerous society that we live in. Jesse, do you have anything to add?
Just that I'm not.
Oh boy.
Connection. There's a little bit of a connection problem.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can hear
me now. I just say that when we talk about Romania, the thing that George did was he allowed there to be by giving books and scholarships and really simple things. I think that the power of that was that it encouraged critical thinking. We say, where do we go from here? You don't have law for fake news, but where we sort of committed to this idea that you can't trust anybody. What it means is that there's no consistent place for you to be able to find information about the society you live in, which is ultimately a Russian strategy developed after sort of Vietnam, we need to get back to trusted sources of information and commit to critical thinking and be able to have an informed electorate, which at the moment it doesn't appear that we do. Even though, I think the one thing you can't do in an open society is say, well, I don't think there should be an open society. That's really the only rule, is that you have to be tolerant of other voices. So we sort of existed the last few years in a place where we sort of wanted to demonize other people. And I think that's what I would say is that presents great opportunity, reinvent a lot of these institutions. And we as a group of people should be doing that.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Thank you. Jesse, your connection still seems to be a little patchy. If it's possible to connect maybe by cell service or another, maybe you can tether or something, that would be great. I guess, Priscilla, I'll pose this next question to you then. Obviously, and I think also understanding Jesse's background working with SOROS in the past on some projects, you already had this perspective, but I wonder, Priscilla, if you yourself were surprised at the reaction and even some recent reactions to the film here in the US, or if, were you, I'm assuming you were expecting controversy, but maybe you, a bit like me, saw that some of the conspiracies may have been more on the fringes than what it seems to be.
Oh, you mean how mainstream yeah. No, I don't think, it wasn't surprising to me, for a couple of reasons. Again, he is, and we hopefully, for those who've seen the film, he talks about that he is going to anger people by his positions, right? So, and as we see, a lot of the things that he or Open Society Foundations has supported, they are in direct opposition with a lot of, kind of folks in power who want things to go a certain way. And so you have lots of, there's a lot, there's a lot hidden in sort of his belief system. Part of it is a sort of a global world, a global economy versus a nationalism. And so these, I don't think it was really surprising. It's disappointing. And so for us, part of the reason, we feel it's important for people to see the film is, look, you may not like him, you may not like what he's doing, but it's important to at least have some understanding. There's very real understanding about what who he is, what he's done, where he's come from, where he's putting his resources, what is the work of the Open Society Foundations. And I think, you know, Gina was saying, what's really important to think about, he does not, he invests in people in places where where voices are not being heard, and he lets those people determine how they want to be, how they want to participate in civil society. It's not that he's going around and saying this is what's going to happen. That's one of the biggest, you know, myths about him, that sort of puppet master, right? And I think what's interesting, we've been doing some of these screenings and panels. What's coming up for a lot of people that have seen the film now is, why aren't other very powerful philanthropists, you know, being treated the same way? And so there is definitely an element of anti-Semitism that comes into this. You know, so there's a lot of forces that come into it. As I said, it isn't surprising. It's disheartening because, you know, Jesse, did you want to say something?
No, I mean, I agree with that. You know, it's disheartening, but I do think that there's reasons for optimism, because I think a lot of people came out over the last few years and responded in a really good way.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've got to just build on that and keep, you know, doing good things.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that thinking about the, you know, parallels to other philanthropists, I think there aren't any others funding what SOROS has funded and what he's supported. And, you know, vaccines are now suddenly a bit more controversial. And so you do see these conspiracy theories about what Gates's intentions are with supporting vaccine campaigns. And so I think, you know, obviously scale is key, but it's also what the, you know, program areas are that he's funding are threatening to people that don't want to share voices and hear minority voices.
You know, there's also a big difference between Gates and what George Soros does. Both are great, but, you know, Bill Gates is really concerned with measurement. So, you know, measurement can be how many, you know, before this it'd be how many malaria vaccinations are there. You know, now it's how many vaccinations are there for COVID. But the difference is with George is he's chasing an intangible, and the intangible, you know, how do we say, do we have a better democracy? Well, that's a much, you know, more intangible, you know, you can measure it.
We lost you again.
Yeah, we lost your audio.
That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about, is like, how do we start to take that eye that we put on other countries and put it on ourselves and try and make our own democracy better, which I think it's very complicated and nuanced. And, you know, the original goals got off to a slow start. And I think we're probably off to a slow start now. COVID, I think, is impacting our world in a dreadful way. You know, when we talk about the, you know, people living on $1 a day or $2 a day, many millions, hundreds of millions of people have been pushed back below the poverty line. And this test that we've had, which, you know, COVID is about, you know, really about the environment. It's sort of a proxy for sort of the battle ahead on the environment. You know, what you see is this, the haves and the have-nots being separated even more, and it being, you know, becoming an even more complicated situation. You know, I always think about disability rights, because in disability rights, we've had the, you know, the good fortune to have a compact on disability rights at the UN. And the way that was negotiated was, you know, one example would be people who are deaf and blind, you know, don't want their parents involved in what they're doing. But if you have a intellectual disability, you know, then you have to have them there. So they have to compromise between these two groups of rights, you know, in a totally different way. Well, you know, when we talk about human rights and we talk about rights and we look down the road to the future that all the people in this call's kids will have, the way that they're going to be, the intersection of these rights is going to be much more important than the way that we think about them, because we tend to think about them in sort of, you know, different buckets. But the question how they all work together, and I think they explore in the coming years. So
Sorry, we can't hear you, Jesse.
Yeah, we've got.
I'm handing it back to you.
Oh,
All right. Well, I want to say one other thing, not necessarily about I mean, yes, I want to go back to something that Rebecca said, though, which is that, because I was thinking, you know, when you're saying, was it surprising, and what other philanthropists did? You're exactly right. I don't think we've ever seen, and we may never see again, a person who is entered the field of philanthropy with the amount of money, who is himself calls, you know, referred to as a political philanthropist, and in that regard, meaning going to invest and support things that are not popular, that are, you know, controversial, and that extend beyond, you know, wherever he might live, which is a big sort of theme, I think, from the film, and our very brilliant, you know, Eastern intellectual Ivan Krastev, who we had the, you know, wonderful pleasure and honor of interviewing many times. But he says that, you know, for him, you're not just morally responsible for your part of the world, right? And that it's this idea that the borders of our moral responsibility. So if you want to be free, then the conditions for this to happen is that everybody should be free. And that means you might go outside of where you live. And I think that's another reason why, you know, he is very controversial, because people feel like, stay in your own country. Well, what is that? Is that Hungary? Is that the United States, right? Germany? And he's interested in protecting the rights of others who don't have the ability to do that. And that pisses a lot of people off. And so, you know, it's unfortunate, but that is something we really have to ponder about, what kind of world we want to live in, and what is our responsibility as human beings for other human beings. You know, that's one of, I think, the central questions for me that the film is asking.
yeah. And I think, you know, I teach often on our nonprofit track, and the course I'm teaching this semester is about financial resource development. And we do a lot on the history of philanthropy and philosophies of altruism. And I think we don't always have an opportunity in the public administration classroom to bring in films that really hit on such current issues, but also topically on the things we discover. And so it got me thinking a lot about the role of the arts and filmmaking, and in educating the public and in public awareness. And I think on one level, there's the story and the legacy of George Soros, but also if you could, as filmmakers, talk a bit about how you're motivated to educate society. And then I'd also love to hear Gina's perspective a bit on how culture and the arts has a role, even in a classroom that, you know, might not seem like the natural place to be watching documentaries.
Yes, I do want to add a little bit to also to the discussion, and just a bit of my perspective, that I think what is different with George from other philanthropists, and then I'll answer to you, Rebecca, is that he's trying to, I mean, he looks into these areas where there is like a power debate and a power, you know, a fight for power. And what he's trying to do, actually, he's trying to, is I'm seeing it so controversial in the United States, and I reflect about to ask me why, because now I'm being in between two worlds. I kind of understand, I've been here long enough, since 2004, to understand some of the specifics of the United States. But I think he's trying to go and we're seeing this currently, how we're promoting diversity but not inclusion. So I think his concept of open society as applied to the United States is trying to include those unheard voices into the political process, into the decision. And that's what that's what makes people angry about it. So I think he's kind of this advocate from the shadow who's doing this work. I was reflecting on how I have to admit that I haven't used a documentary or a movie as an educational resource up to now. So I used either segments or short videos, or, you know, because I think, and just thinking, but I now going through this experience, and this is a learning experience for myself as well, I think it's so beneficial. And the idea of storytelling, especially the times we live in right now, is so important. Since we do not have this personal interactions, I think the film playing can be a way to bring us closer together, to share global stories like what George Soros did and what you guys did through filming this documentary. So it kind of gives a different perspective to the United States. For instance, I often have this discussion with my students and try to offer them both, you know, perspectives and see, you know, you have to be grateful, you have so many things, you know, and just giving them examples. Yes, I know there is a lot of work to be done, but there are things that if you have something to compare it with, so I think that's very beneficial. I also, I mean, when I use media, and I think now maybe Open Society, other, you know, philanthropic organization, or I would say organizations working within the civil society would have a crucial role in informing our students, you know, backing up on what is credible information. Is you both brought up the idea of fake news. And I do have this discussion with students in every class I teach. Okay, let's go over, you know, I know you're going to use your Instagram, your Twitter, but you would have to see where is that source of information coming from? Is it credible? And we even last night, we had a discussion about think tanks and, you know, how, I mean, yes, they do promote the ideology because there are, you know, they are funded from various sources, but there are ways to look at their credibility, you know, and they just gave an example, you know, how many times they are cited in the credible media outlets. You know, that would be a measure if they want to really make a decision for themselves. So we do have this discussion when we talk and integrate materials coming from, you know, different media outlets. But I think I do welcome, thank you again for this opportunity to be part of this panel. So I think I do envision this as a future educational resource used more and more in the classroom in every discipline.
Yeah, I'm with Gina. I've never had my grad students watch a full length film, but this just hits on so many points that fit into our program, into my classroom. And I wonder, just as filmmakers, like, did you have this in mind that professors like Gina and I would be assigning this? Was that one of your goals? Like, how do you view your role as filmmakers in educating society?
You're on mute, Jesse.
You want to take that?
Sure. I'm worried about his balance, but I think, well, first of all, for this project, I mean, you know, we both together and separately have worked on many, many, you know, projects. I think this definitely was honestly one of the most important reasons why we did the film, because we felt like it is to try to at least, you know, give some sense of the person's life, this person that everybody has an idea about, doesn't really know too much about him, to hear from himself, which is really important. We very rarely, you know, he's written many, many books and there's been a lot of interviews about him, but he hasn't done a lot of, you know, public facing, you know, interviews in many, many, many years. And we did think it was important that people like you would use the film, and that it could stand as another piece of the story about who is George Soros. And so that this is for us, really important that you are showing it here. Let it open up a lively conversation. You know, people should debate, as in an open society. There should be conversations around the themes that we hope that come through in the film. So I think, so that's one thing for this film. I mean, storytelling, you know, filmmaking, whether it's short videos, which we make a lot of, short films, long films, they are part of the way that we do communicate with each other, but they should not be the only way. You know, we can't give up on reading and writing and you know, debate and other forms. But the thing about story, you know, filmmaking is that it is a shared collective that people can watch around the world, and it somehow, hopefully, gets to the heart, your heart, the human heart, and to the head, right? So you're bringing in different parts of the human experience, and hopefully people can see something about themselves reflected in a film that they watch. I think it's very interesting that documentaries right now have had they're just flourishing. You know, I think this year the Academy Awards, there were 250 entrants, entrees into the Academy Awards in the documentary division, which is up, something like 100 from, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think there is a real hunger and a need for real stories. Now, again, when you make a movie, even a documentary, you are always going to be seeing or telling your story through your own lens, right? So there is always going to be the frame, and George talks about that in the film. You can never really get away from your own perspective of the world. So I think that's also an important thing to think about when we're all watching stories. You know, who's telling the story, and what is it that they're interested in, because every filmmaker will have a point of view about what they've learned in the making of a movie. Jesse, do you have anything?
Well, the other thing I would say about that is, it's a lot of times in societies, the only place to be able to do something is through making a movie or painting on a wall or writing a poem. So art is very, very important in societies because it may be the only, it's where change really begins, is in in the artwork that people make. And sometimes those artists are difficult to look at. Sometimes it can be very challenging, but the point is they have a very important role in an open society, which is just to start to, go around the edges and point at things that are problematic. I think you saw that with a lot of the artwork that was made in the last few years around Black Lives Matter, especially. But if so you have to have those outlets in order to change society in one way or another. And then I movie is that my hope would be just that when people see it, that they will think critically, and then I think that one thing that's important about George is that he really does strategize about how to change things in society. And one of the things that happens in nonprofits is they get super prescriptive. And I've often thought that a lot of the magic of really good nonprofits is when they think non-linearly about how to unpack a problem in a different way. We work with a lot of nonprofits. I'm thinking now about the Nature Conservancy. We did a project with them where they bought a fleet of fishing boats, and they leased to the fishermen on the one condition that they wouldn't, fish out every. And the magic of that is not the fishermen. The magic of that is that a group of people sat down around a table and said, well, how can we make this work for everybody and not kill everything on the planet? And so I think that the challenge is about a lot of these systemic problems that we deal with in society is that they need lots of different strategies about how to fix them. And then they need that non-linear thinking about how the problem might be challenged in a new and totally different way. George Soros funds a lot of things where he's in place that are totally different ideas about how the change would happen, and identify different important, because what tends to happen in nonprofits is people, if they say, well, geez, this is how it's going to be fixed. And you really can't know that except by the people who live in the place and decide that they're going to actually make the change. The people on the ground know what to do, and what you have to do is support those people, and they'll figure it out. It's not, when we use the word investment, it's not investment like you're a bank. It's investment in people and things. And again, it gets back to that idea of what is the return on investment, and it's not binary. It's not money. It's how do we make democracy better? How do we make open society more responsive? How do we make sure everybody's voice is heard? The last thing I would say about it is that it's right. You got to keep trying to make it better. That's why it's not an ideology like Nazism or communism. It's this other idea, which is, a thing that's open to always being changed by new people and new ideas.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of my research areas that I bring into the classroom is impact investing, and in the impact investing marketplace right now, there's such a tension because you have individuals who are asset managers who are so used to that very clear market rate return, and they're looking for some equivalent in the social outcome, and it's really hard to find. And even if and we talk about outcomes and program evaluation a lot in our program with our students, and the even when you think what your outcome is, you often aren't taking into consideration unintended consequences, and maybe that last dollar to have 100% malaria vaccination could have been spent better on something else or something more necessary. And as you're talking about it, Jesse and Priscilla, I was thinking about the difference between baking and cooking. And they say that baking is a science and cooking is an art, and it does seem, what even listening to, and towards the end of the film when George Soros was talking about how at some point he felt that he had failed at everything. Then he just realized that the outcomes were much different than what he had intended them to be. And I think sometimes we pressure nonprofit organizations to report back outcomes that are so clear and hard that we don't even encourage them to look elsewhere or admit what might not be a failure, but just a difference in outcome. And so I think there's a lot of like unpacking we could do in the classroom, thinking about his approach. And obviously the outcome of an open society is something that's hard to measure at its very core, but you also have a philanthropist who's open to the outcome. And so,
yeah.
and open to the process, right? Which is so rare. And then just thinking about his theory of change and his model of philanthropy, as we've kind of talked about kind of unexpectedly today, is something really interesting that, as researchers and scholars, Gina and I could think about maybe how we could unpack that model and how it differs so much from other models of philanthropy, both in its intention, its process, in its measures. But I'm seeing,
a couple of things.
Go ahead.
One thing I would just say about that in regards to impact investing is sometimes, if you can find an innovation and it works in one place, it doesn't necessarily mean it's scalable. If you look at Bill Drayton and the way he thinks about change, and how he would go into societies in the 70s and just pick the best social entrepreneur. They've undoubtedly built a great, it's an incredible operation, but I don't think he would say that each idea is scalable infinitely. It can be, if it works in one town, that can be a success in and of itself.
Yeah.
And then the thing that I always get into with impact investing is that not everything is, a lot of time, we did some work with the RISE Fund. Well, if you look deeply at a lot of the outcomes there, what they did was take a really good idea, but then when it wasn't scalable enough, they would turn it into a commercially viable idea because they're trying to make the return on investment. So it really is a mindset around what the future of society is, what money is in a society, that going forward, all these ideas are becoming very real. You see it with, Bitcoin, and what does that mean for societies? There's so many complicated, interesting questions that arise when we think about where we're going from here,
Yeah. I wonder if there's anything else. We're just about out of time. I did try to incorporate a couple of questions I see in the chat as we go. I had a couple direct messages. Is there anything else that you want to share? Or, oh, I see Jesse's still talking, but I can't hear.
No, I'm not talking.
Oh, your mouth is still. That's kind of cool.
Sorry about my phone problems.
I've often thought about cloning myself, and that was a moment. But thank you both so much for being here. I think it's always nice to be involved in an event like this, that I feel like I'm a student again. And I really, really appreciate the film itself. Thank you for making it. Thank you for sharing it. We're honored to be part of your process. I'd love to talk more to both of you about how you pivoted over this last year as partners working on this and the film promotion and rollout, but that'll have to be for another day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us. You
Thank
know,
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, it's been really an eye opener. And by the way, my son is 12 and I asked him to watch the documentary with me. So this way he would understand more things.
was he interested?
Yeah, he's sat with me through the, I mean, some things were very controversial and he said, wow, I cannot believe things like this happened around the world. And I said, yes, they did. So,
Yeah.
So yes, that was very, very informative. A better way to tell the story.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you for your time. Good luck with
Thank
everything.
you.
Bye,
Stay
you
safe,
guys.
everybody. Bye.